tried to do is, I guess, select one part of the coaching research and the coaching science and see what we could manage to summarise and present for you in a sort of 1 hour session. So I have focused on coaching for competition performance in particular. And we'll be looking at this very much from a sort of evidence-based point of view. Just a little bit about me, I suppose. There's a lot of familiar faces in the room, so I do know a lot of people here, but I'm sure some of you are thinking, who's this nerdy academic that they've parachuted in here to sort of bore us for the next hour? My background was in equestrian. I was previously a level 3 coach in eventing and a level 2 dressage coach and a coach educator for many years. And then I did a bit of a 180 about 10 years ago and decided that I wanted to sort of pursue a little bit more formal coach education. So I completed a master's degree in coach ed at the University of Sydney and got really fascinated by the sports psychology side of things and the science of athlete development. And I was very fortunate to get a scholarship which then enabled me to pursue that a little more, and I've been completing a doctorate, which thankfully is almost finished. The finish line's in sight. So I've been sort of engaged for the last couple of years part-time, lecturing in the postgrad program in that coach education space at the university, and at the same time involved in some really interesting research projects with a number of professional sports and elite sports in coach ed and elite athlete development. And I've been extremely fortunate in the last few years in terms of opportunities to present at some fascinating conferences, and a couple of those are on the screen there at the moment. So I guess I just wanted to pre-warn you that despite the equestrian background, what I'm actually going to present to you this afternoon is about coaching research across a whole range of sports. And I know from experience, because I've spent many years sitting where you're sitting now, that as equestrian coaches, we're really aware that our context is quite unique and that we're actually dealing with 2 athletes. And so our eyes have a tendency to glaze over when people start to talk about other sports, particularly football, and a lot of my research has been in that area, strangely enough. So I'm going to ask you just to stick with me, and the reason that I haven't deliberately contextualised this work for an equestrian audience is not because I was being lazy. It's because what we know about expert coaches across all sports is they actually look and search far and wide to enhance their learning and to get that competitive edge. They don't stay in the silo of their own sport. In fact, they don't even just stay looking in sport per se. They look into other domains like pilot training, surgical training, even military. So they're really innovative, and they're really the biggest learning and the most gains and the biggest leverage comes when we kind of go out of our comfort zone, look at something a little bit new that challenges our thinking a little bit, and then we spend some time with our colleagues brainstorming about how might that work in our space? You know, how could we possibly leverage that, and what does it look like? So if I was going to be very prescriptive and stand up here and tell you exactly how to apply this in your space, the learning wouldn't be so effective, and we'd come up with one model. Whereas if each of you go away and mull that over yourselves and try it out in your context, we'll probably come up with a lot better solutions. So before we get into what the research has really got to say, I'd just like you to reflect for a moment and think about, why do we coach the way that we coach? What shaped and informed the way that we coach, meaning all of us? So the research is very, very strong here that almost all coaches, whether they do it consciously or subconsciously, tend to replicate the way they were coached. There's the odd exception where someone has had a particularly negative experience, usually with a really autocratic coach, and they felt they didn't have a lot of control, and they sort of push back against that. But most coaches replicate the way that they were coached. And they often do that with very little examination about whether that's actually an effective way to coach, or is that in line with what the research says is the best practice. We just tend to instinctively do it. The other thing that tends to shape the way we coach is the cultural norms within the sport. So every sport has them, and they vary from sport to sport. But what we find is, again, there's accepted ways of doing things within a sport, and they tend to shape what we do. Whether we mean to let that happen or not, there's often that sort of social pressure to, not step too far out of the box, not do something that's perceived to be a little weird or a little random. Now, within traditional sports like equestrian, we do find that these cultural norms are very strong, and they're quite difficult to challenge. In some of the newer Olympic sports like surfing and some of the aerial snow sports, there's not such a long history of structured coach education, and there's not that tradition. So we see a lot of experimentation and innovation in coaching in those sports. So I guess the message I'm trying to get through there is that the norms really vary from sport to sport. I think this one's really salient for you as equestrian coaches, and I just want to create this context, so bear with me here for a minute. You work in a really unique environment as a coach. Most of you are working in a fee-for-service model. Your athletes are actually paying clients. Now think about that for a minute. You're like a golf pro or a tennis pro. And that's quite a different context, because your survival in the industry often relies on the fact that those clients keep coming back every week, or that you keep getting asked back to teach those clinics every month or every weekend. Now, whether you realise it or not, that's actually influencing your decisions as a coach and the way that you coach. And that makes sense, okay, because your very survival relies on that. It's a really different context when you contrast it to, say, a professional coach who might have a contract for a couple of years if they're lucky, and a team that is actually contracted as well. Or maybe an academy coach who has elite athletes in their program that are selected to that situation. The difference being those coaches have a little bit more latitude to make maybe uncomfortable or unpopular decisions that might be in the best interests of their athletes' long-term development. That's a little bit harder to do when you need them to come back each week, okay? So what we see happen is your coaching tends to be shaped and evolved a little bit by these things. Now, of course, there is formal coach education, but the research is really interesting here and a little challenging for someone whose career is in coach education. There's very little transference from formal coach education programs to what coaches actually do in the field. Okay, we find there's not a lot of transfer. Now, some of that is because coaches are quite embedded in their practices by the time they come to formal education, but a lot of it is because the social learning, that learning from other coaches and those social norms is so strong that it overrides that formal education. The other issue is that for a lot of sports, their coach education model is really poorly resourced, and that's not a criticism. Sports are poor. Most sports don't have a lot of money to invest in coach education. So sometimes the programs have been developed and it's sort of a set and forget, and then haven't necessarily kept pace with how the research in learning and coaching science has changed. So what I want to sort of talk to you about this afternoon is what we call evidence-based practice. Now, if I'd said those words to you a year ago, you probably would have squinted and said, what's she talking about? But given the COVID pandemic, this is all over the news, and I think everyone has a much greater understanding of what we mean when we talk about evidence-based practice or peer-reviewed research. So everything that I'm going to present to you this afternoon is based on robust peer-reviewed evidence. It's not my opinion, okay? So I just want you to understand that before we start. So let's take a moment to think about, what do we think effective coaching for performance looks like? Okay, so if we kind of reflect and think, what do we reckon that looks like? If I paint a picture for you of a coaching session or a training session, and it's, pretty ordered, looks fairly structured, everything's running quite smoothly. The coach is giving pretty explicit instructions to the athletes. He or she is telling them what to do, when to do it, how to do it. They're getting a number of repetitions at the exercise, and at the end of each repetition, the coach is giving them feedback about how they did it, how to improve it. There's not a lot of mistakes happening. And overall, it looks like, if we consider it a group lesson, everybody in that lesson or coaching session is actually making some really observable improvement. So most of us would go, okay, that looks like a pretty good coaching session, you know, we're all pretty happy with that. Would it challenge your perceptions and your thinking about coaching if I was to tell you that the research suggests that that kind of coaching environment and that kind of coaching is actually not very productive in terms of preparing your athletes for competition? And worse than that, you're actually more than likely giving them skills that are not going to be robust under pressure, that won't be durable and lasting. They're actually very transient. That observable improvement that you're seeing within that coaching session, if we want to call it that, or that lesson or that clinic, is more than likely what we would term temporary improvement on a task. So it's not actually learning. Learning is a permanent change to an athlete's capability to actually perform that task in a varied environment. What you're seeing is a very narrow improvement, and the gains that you're seeing more than likely fade very quickly. And this is a big part of the reason why people say, I can never get my horse to go as well at home as it goes in the lesson. You know, I can never replicate that at a competition. So that coaching that I've described, that very prescriptive, very explicit coaching, is fantastic for getting that short-term performance improvement. And it's probably great for getting our clients to come back next week. And it probably almost guarantees they're going to book another clinic. But it's not the most effective way to prepare your athletes for competition. And one of the most unsettling things is that that kind of coaching makes your athletes much more likely to choke under pressure. And so what we're going to talk about today is how can we do this better? And what does that look like? So I apologise to those of you that, you know, may have found that it's a little confronting and it might sort of be challenging your whole coaching playbook. But I'm not going to leave you hanging. I'm hoping that I can actually help you go away with some more thoughts about how maybe we can do this a little better. So let's just think about what the competition environment looks like for a moment. It's not very predictable, okay? There's a lot of variation. There's a lot of things that are going to spring up that we weren't planning on. There's distractions. One of the key things is that you as the coach can't be there in the arena or out on that course with your athlete. So ultimately, you're trying to develop autonomous athletes. Coaching your athletes for competition's a bit like parenting. You know, you've done your job well when you are redundant, okay? So if you're going to helicopter parent them, they're not going to cope very well out there in the competition environment. So the skills that I've got on the board here, these are very universal. Oh, my little pointer doesn't want to play, sorry. They're very universal across all sporting contexts. So they're psychological and cognitive skills that athletes need to be able to perform to the best of their ability in competition. So if you look down that list, these are all things, and if you look at the top three, they all mention the self. So there's this idea of autonomy. We need them to be able to monitor what's happening, monitor their own sort of arousal levels and their own emotional state, and to self-regulate. We need them to be able to solve problems and to respond to different stimuli. We need them to be able to refocus when something goes wrong. And we need them to do all of that without you being there. So you can probably see that that kind of really prescriptive, explicit kind of coaching where you're telling them exactly what to do every step of the way and you're almost riding the horse from the ground is really not going to help develop these kind of skills. Okay, so this analogy here of the zoo tiger and the jungle tiger, a lot of you might have seen this. A guy called Trevor Reagan does a fabulous TED talk on it that's well worth a watch. It's not sports specific, it's just about learning in general. But the idea is that, you know, if we're trying to develop athletes that are going to have skills to survive in the jungle, which, let's face it, that's kind of what competing under pressure is like, there's a lot of variability, there's a lot of things, you know, that we need to be able to think rapidly and make good decisions about. It's not really going to work if we train in the zoo. So if you look at the zoo tiger, his environment's really predictable. He doesn't have to make many decisions on a daily basis. Someone brings him his food at the same time every day. You know, he doesn't have to go out and hunt for it. You know, there's not a lot of adaptation. So it's very predictable and safe and very comfortable. But it isn't equipping that tiger for surviving in the jungle. Okay, so that's a simplistic way, I guess, of looking at that, but it might help you to convey to your athletes why you want them to train in a little bit more of an uncomfortable way. So expert coaches, and what I guess should define by expert coaches is coaches that achieve sustained, repeatable success with successive athletes over successive cycles, okay, not just short term. They understand this instinctively and they do things differently. What are some of the things that they do differently? Well, they spend, on proportion, the research tells us, a lot more time designing the practice environment and the practice activities. They spend more time doing that so that it will be the activity itself or the environment that creates the learning rather than a high volume of explicit instructions from the coach. They also spend a lot of time simulating the competition environment, so they really understand the potency of simulation. If you think about in those life and death kind of careers, like flying a plane, you know, performing surgery or running a military operation, they don't just get told how to do it. They practice in a simulated environment, and expert coaches get that, and they go to enormous lengths to do that with their athletes. Practice also looks different. It doesn't look necessarily neat and tidy. A lot of the time you'll see a lot more mistakes being made. The athletes won't look so comfortable. They actually look like they're struggling at times. The practice is quite random and it's kind of variable. An example of this that I thought really brought it home for me, and excuse the football analogy, I was working with a New Zealand rugby coach and who was now coaching in Australia in an elite youth program, and he was talking about when he first came over here. Those of you that are rugby heads in the audience or have husbands that are, you know, you're probably aware of how superior, dare I say it, the Kiwis are in the rugby space. They were one of the first organisations to really come to understand this idea of training, what they call chaos training or training ugly. And so what happened when this coach first came to Australia is in an elite youth camp, you know, his guys are playing small-sided games and they're doing a lot of decision making and it all looks kind of messy, and to the parent onlookers it looks like he's got no idea what he's doing and complete chaos is reigning. The Aussie coach alongside him, they're all doing really structured and organised drills that require absolutely no problem solving and no decision making and are quite robotic. No surprise that the parents on the side are kind of going, what's this dude over here doing? He's not talking very much at all and this looks really messy. Whereas this coach over here is doing a lot of talking and it all looks very organised. But the learning from the athletes that are in the chaotic environment is far superior. So that's how they develop that ability to read the play, you know, to be able to read the environment and respond to the stimuli. It's by it being unpredictable. The feedback looks very different as well. And I know I found this really confronting when I first started working in this space. I'd been conditioned that, you know, you needed to talk a lot. People needed to feel like they were getting their bang for their buck. And that was what was rewarded. But the feedback in this environment with expert coaches, they say a lot less. What they do say is really targeted, right on point and very concise and you know, really good error correction, but they don't say a lot. They ask a lot more questions and they ask really good questions. So they're really challenging the athletes to try to problem solve. And sometimes that feedback process is not verbal. They use other forms of feedback, and I'll unpack that a little bit more later. But they also focus on trying to build in as many decision-making opportunities in their training as possible. Because once your motor skills as a rider get to a certain level, once your position's solid, once you can apply the aids with good timing, those kind of things, most of the sport is about decision making. From your point of view, if we set aside the horse training part of it and we just talk about the human, once those skills are in place, pretty much irrespective of which of the disciplines you're in, it comes down to decision making. So let's have a little bit of a closer look at what we can do in terms of competition simulation. Now, we all try to do this, don't we? We try to ride the test, we try to jump a course, but is it really simulated competition if you're riding in your arena at home and it's lovely and quiet and there's no spectators and there's no pressure and there's no loudspeaker and there's no flapping flags and there's no kid jumping up and letting their seat go bang in the grandstand? You know, so just how close to competition is it? And if we ride a movement and we don't quite like how it went and we go around and we have another crack at it, is that simulating competition? Okay, so we really encourage coaches, and this is again what the expert coaches do, identify what the key characteristics of your competition environment are and then mimic them and replicate them as closely as you can. And that might even mean mimicking them for a particular venue. Certain venues, certain environments will have certain built-in challenges, you know. That might be a long way from the warm-up arena to the main arena and there's plenty of stuff for him to shy at along the way. You know, there might be certain things that you know about a particular environment that you need to train for. Try to replicate that as much as you can. One of the simplest things, I think, and I reflect on my time as a coach in equestrian, whenever it was windy, hot, raining, I'd always get these phone calls, oh, I can't come today, it's a bit windy, or it's a bit raining, or, you know, what happens at a competition? It's not always going to be 25 degrees perfectly still and sunny. So how well are we preparing for competition if we only ride when it's all nice and quiet? Okay, you know, so if you're coaching at home and, you know, the kids are trying to ride their quad bike around the arena and other stuff's going on and there's this pressure to have it all lovely and quiet and perfect, again, how well are you equipping your athletes to be able to perform in competition? Okay, so we've got to think outside the box a little bit. So we talk about manipulating the constraints. That's just a fancy way of saying change the environment, change the task, change the activity. And we use this little acronym called PRIC, excuse the pun. How can you mix up the pressure? How can you change the intensity? Make sure it's really relevant to competition and introduce some chaos. Now, I'm not suggesting, I know we've got to balance safety and we've also got to balance the horse's confidence as well. So it's a really delicate balance. You need to know your athletes really well, know the horse well, and know those boundaries. But you need to really sit in that space and think, well, how can we do that? How can I, you know, by manipulating the time that you have to do something, that can add pressure. By shrinking the space, and this is a really big one that other sports use, and I think maybe we don't use it enough, you know, maybe we can utilise that. One great example of this is in Brazil, they play a game called soccer in the room, and I've said that in English because I can't say it in their language, but they basically play a full-sided game of soccer in a room the size of a normal room of a house. And the research around that, stick with me here, it sounds kind of weird, is that it increases the decision-making demands on those players by around 600%. And that game alone, which all developing soccer players play in Brazil, is largely the reason why there are so many of them in the top European leagues and why their decision-making is so superior. So sometimes shrinking the space can do that. So, you know, if you train in a space that's a little smaller, what do you think you experience when you go into a bigger space? suddenly you feel like you've got all this time. Those markers are not coming up so quickly. Those fences are not coming up so quickly. I feel like I've got the luxury of time. One of the other things that other sports do, which we probably can't always do in our sport due to safety and, you know, trying to manage our horses' soundness, is they train at above game intensity and above game speed. So just a really interesting little analogy there. Many, many moons ago, I lived and competed in New Zealand for a number of years in eventing, and it was a long time ago, back when CNC 4-star was called advanced. And in the domestic competitions in New Zealand back then, the speed for the advanced class was 600 metres per minute. But at the same time, the FEI speed for the 3-day event was 575 metres per minute. At that particular time in the early 90s, the Kiwis were the world champions. I found myself, when I first was competing there, really, really hard to make time at the 1-day events, like seriously hard to make time. But when you got to the 3-day event, it was like, man, this is like cantering around the park. All of a sudden, it was like, whoa, I've got so much more time. So just an example, I'm not advocating that we go out and necessarily do that, but I'm just trying to help you make those links a little bit. Another thing that we can do to add pressure is to add anxiety. So there's some, you know, psychological tools we use to measure an athlete's anxiety state. And we do this to them in research and measure their anxiety to know that it's been effective and that we've really, you know, got them panicking before we administer these tests. One way to do that for some athletes is simply to make them perform in front of their peers. That's normally enough to make a lot of them feel really self-conscious. For others, it might be saying, hey, we're going to video this training session. The selectors have asked to see this, you know, with a view to selection decisions. Anything that you can do that's going to create that little bit of anxiety, not tip them over into a fear response, but to try to mimic the kind of performance anxiety that they will experience in competition, that's going to help desensitise to them that a little bit before they compete. The other thing that we find that the research is very, very strong about, and it is mirrored in the practices of those expert coaches, is that they do a lot of scenario training. And what I mean by scenario training is they try to identify every single thing that could possibly go wrong from the moment they leave home, not necessarily just at the competition, but getting there, all the logistics, the warm-up, the competition, and they war game out everything. Okay, because let's face it, some of the things that will undermine your competition might start before you even get in the truck. And, you know, it might be the flat tyre on the way. It might be the fact that you're running late and you get there and you don't have a lot of warm-up. So they literally war game everything. And one of the best examples of this that I've heard about was one that Rick Charlesworth did in the lead up to the Beijing Olympics, and some of you may have heard about it. So there was a lot of talk leading into Beijing about the traffic congestion, a lot of concerns about how well they were going to be able to get athletes to venues and whether they were going to be running late. So on one of their sort of recce trips to experience the environment, he got the bus driver to pretend that the bus had broken down on their way to a game. About 2 k's from the stadium, everybody out, grab your kit bag and let's hot-foot it to the stadium. You're going to arrive stressed, fatigued and late and no warm-up. They didn't know that it had been staged, okay? But they're the sort of scenario trainings that these coaches engage in at that level. No, we can't necessarily achieve that with all of the athletes that you're coaching in that sort of fee-for-service environment, but there's little bits of that we can start to draw on. So sometimes it's about that high leverage practice, just trying to pinpoint for an individual athlete, what is their biggest fear? You know, what are the things that are going to bring them unstuck? Some people, as I've used this example, you know, get really worried about being held up on course on cross country and losing their concentration, losing their focus, switching off a bit and having to start sort of cold. And that might be exacerbated if there's a really difficult combination coming up. So how can we deliberately train those kind of things? You might find you've got, you know, a horse that or a rider that's making poor decisions when they're fatigued towards the end of the course. So training fresh is really not going to be very useful. Okay? Another thing that these expert coaches do is they actually deliberately build adversity into their programs. And when I talk about this form of adversity, I mean in the longer term. So we're talking an athlete that you're working with over a number of years. And they try to identify certain times in that athlete's development when they think it's really appropriate to really challenge their mental toughness and to try to create some resilience. And the way that other coaches in other sports do this is they'll drop a player from the team, not because they've got poor form, just to see how they cope with it. Are they going to sulk, or are they going to work really hard for the next week to try and get back on the team? Or they'll put them up a grade and make them train with the team above them, you know. Or they will give them some really tough feedback. Or, you know, they just try to create these situations. If someone's really struggling with bad ref calls, or in our case, you know, maybe some really negative judging feedback that might really rattle them, they try to replicate that and create that adversity. You're probably getting the sense that this kind of environment and creating it takes a lot of imagination, a lot of creativity, quite a bit of innovation, and you really need to think outside the box. So we've talked about the environment, but what about the skills? Now, I said to you before that that really explicit style of coaching creates this kind of illusion of learning that doesn't stick under pressure. So I probably need to unpack that for you because it's a pretty big statement to make. What we now know about learning from neuroscience and from learning science and cognition work is that learning sticks better when we've had to figure it out for ourselves rather than being told. If someone just tells you the answer and you don't have to struggle a little bit to figure it out, you forget it pretty quickly. So that struggle is really important. If you don't read anything else this year, if you haven't already read it, try to read this book called The Talent Code by Daniel Coyle. Or if you're not a reader, he's got a really good website and he has a lot of blog articles on there. I could talk about this research forever because the nerd in me gets kind of excited, but I'll try to control myself. He spent 2 years travelling the world, going to all these, what he called talent hotbeds all over the world. They weren't all about sport. Some were music schools, there was tennis academies, there was chess, you know, academies, there were schools involved. But the common denominator was all of these places somehow managed to produce a ridiculous amount of people that performed at a really, really high level. So they tried to figure out, well, what was the common denominator? And so we worked with some leading neuroscientists to try to figure this out. And it was a certain kind of practice that they all engaged in, and we call it deep practice. And essentially it's like operating right at the edge of your abilities, like on that tipping point right before you're sort of into that freaked out, really frightened stage, but at the very edge of your abilities. And that feeling of kind of trying to do something and not quite making it, and then trying again and not quite making it, that struggle and that frustration and that kind of burning feeling of not being able to nail it is actually the sensation of new neural pathways being developed in your brain. And neuroscientists call it desirable difficulty, okay? And it's kind of a sweet spot at the very edge of your abilities, and that's where we want to, in that learning zone where we really want to get our athletes to. Again, the caveat about safety and horse confidence, so don't go crazy, but try to sort of think about how you might embrace that idea a little bit. And so I can't help but want to share some of why that works with you. If you think about the circuitry in your brain as a whole lot of wires, and myelin, and you might remember that term from biology at school, is kind of this white substance that wraps around the circuitry, and it's like insulation, I suppose, is one way to describe it. The research in this area shows that when a circuit is sort of not myelinated or not wrapped in this insulation or this white matter, The signals travel at around 2 miles per second. Excuse the American measurements. It was research done largely in the US. When that circuitry is fully wrapped in myelin, like 50 layers or thereabouts, it speeds up to about 200 metres per second. So when we watch someone like Roger Federer and everybody goes, oh, he's got this amazing ability to anticipate where the ball's going to come from, what their opposition's going to do, it's because that circuitry is so much better insulated. It's like you've got broadband in your brain. So the signal just goes so much faster. So he's still processing information. He's still processing pattern recall and remembering things that he's seen in before and making decisions. He's just doing it a whole lot faster than someone else. So we can accelerate that kind of learning, because what we know from when they hook up scans to people's heads while they make these kind of struggles is that when you struggle with something and try to solve it, you're firing that circuitry in a way that stimulates the production of the myelin, okay? So struggle is good. What's really important though about this kind of training and this kind of practice, if you're going to take your athletes to that place, you've got to create a very special environment and culture around mistakes. You have to change the thinking about mistakes, okay? If you don't respond to mistakes in the right way, you can develop athletes who have a fear of failure, and nothing will stunt development quicker than athletes not being game to take risks, okay, when they're learning. So what we know about learning is that we need to make errors and make mistakes to learn. So brain scans show us that there's this critical little moment about 0.25 seconds after we make a blunder where we do one of two things. We either go, oh, Jesus, look the other way, close our eyes, pretend it didn't happen, or we look really hard at that mistake. We lean into it and we try to discover what happened, why it happened, and what we're going to do differently. And what we know, again from research, is that expert athletes and expert performers look really hard at their mistakes. In a psychological sense, we call it attending to a mistake, okay? They don't look away. They don't pretend it didn't happen. They don't gloss over it. They really lean into it and look at it and try to unpack it. But the difference is, and this is the important part, they stay what we call task diagnostic. I'll try to put that in English for you. It simply means they focus on it in an objective way. They don't get emotional and engage in self-doubt. So instead of looking at the mistake closely and going, oh God, you know, and starting to doubt themselves, they just look at it as data. They look clearly at the facts. What happened? Why did this happen? How can I change that? So they're very objective about it. I did some research in 2013 with a number of our elite eventing riders into performing under pressure. And that was even before I'd read this research, and it's amazing how closely it aligned. The athletes who tended to perform best under pressure had this ability to reframe mistakes in that way. So as a coach, you need to create an environment where mistakes are seen, they're embraced. They're seen as a learning opportunity. If you're not making mistakes, you're not really trying, because you're not pushing to the envelope of the learning zone. You're sitting in your comfort zone. No learning happens there, okay? So there needs to be mistakes. It's how we deal with them that is important. And you need to encourage your athletes to see those mistakes as an opportunity to improve and to get better, and not to fear those mistakes. And you also need to not ignore them. You'll hear some coaches, a rider will make a mistake, you know, and I'm sure I've done this myself when I was coaching, and you'll be like, that's okay, don't worry, just come round again. Because part of you doesn't want to draw attention to the mistake. You're worried about the athlete's confidence. You don't want to humiliate them. You don't want them to, you know, start to focus too much on the mistake. But if you've created a healthy environment and culture about mistakes at the outset, you don't need to worry about that, because everyone's on board with this idea that mistakes are good, okay? Because we're learning. If we're making mistakes, we're learning. Once again, though, I do need to reinforce that idea that when we're making mistakes in equestrian and we're riding another athlete, we need to be conscious of that athlete's confidence. So we can't get quite as ballsy in this space as some other sports do. The other thing you can do to equip your athletes with rock solid, the deep practice, make sure that the skills are really embedded and that they're really retrievable in a hurry. Learning implicitly is a way to make sure that the skills stay rock solid under anxiety and under pressure. Most of you are probably doing this anyway. Equestrian coaches are generally really good at analogies, and analogies are a very important part of people trying to learn in an implicit way. So just let me unpack this for those of you who are kind of going, what does she mean by explicit and implicit? When we talk about explicit learning, if I'm trying to teach someone a motor skill and I go through a list of step-by-step instructions and I tell them exactly how to move their body or the parts of their body and how to, execute that skill, I am coaching them explicitly. And what happens is that athlete then has this pool of information or this pool of knowledge with all these steps about exactly how to do that skill. That sounds like a good thing. It's actually not a very good thing, particularly under pressure. Because when we're under pressure and when we get anxious, we tend to ruminate. So we start to overthink and we start to go inward and really what we call self-focus or reinvest. And that's just, again, a fancy academic way of saying we start to overthink the individual parts of how to do the skill. Okay, and what happens when that happens, can everyone remember Greg Norman at the US Open? Okay, he could have probably made that shot every day of the week in training. But he had automatic skills. But what happens when you start to go into this explicit pool of knowledge and you start to think about it step by step, you go from being an expert performer with automated knowledge all the way back to being a novice who's trying to remember, where was I supposed to put that leg and how much pressure and what was I doing here? And all of a sudden it gets clunky and slow and it loses its fluidity and it totally disintegrates, okay? So that's the latest research. It's not to say it'll be the final word on the subject, but that's the latest research about how choking actually happens. It's called Reinvestment and Self-Focus. If you learn a skill implicitly, you don't have that pool of knowledge. If you've learned something implicitly and I say to you, can you tell me how you do that? You're actually kind of going to struggle to tell me how you do it, okay? And that's a good thing. So if you learnt to ride chasing cows around a paddock or playing games on horseback, you would have learnt a whole lot of skills implicitly because, you were just learning to steer, learning to regulate the pace. You didn't really know what you were doing, but you just needed to get from A to B and slow the thing down. So you sort of made it happen without explicit instructions. And so this kind of leads into this idea of explicit coaching being a bit of a problem. So the more that we can teach implicitly, the better. So I've mentioned analogies, and a lot of you will have some fantastic analogies in the equestrian space. There's whole books on them. And so I'm really not telling you anything new here. I'm really just trying to reaffirm that what you're doing is great and keep doing it. Sometimes coaches think that analogies are only when you're teaching kids and trying to make it fun and play games. It's a really, really valuable learning tool. Dual task strategies is another one. Again, sorry, that's just another one of those clunky academic terms. It really just means doing something else to take your mind off the thing you're doing. So humming, singing, counting, those things, if you get your athlete to do that at the same time as they're learning a task, that will actually make them sort of learn it in a more implicit way. And games are another fantastic way of achieving a similar sort of outcome. There's so much research that's been done on this idea of implicit skills, and the testing is amazing. Even under, not only do they stay robust under pressure, but their durability is so much more. When they get two groups of matched athletes and teach implicit versus explicit, when they test again in a month or 6 weeks, man, if you learn it explicitly, you're up the creek. It's gone, it's forgotten, it's faded. You learn it implicitly, it's still there, it's barely deteriorated. Then when they put them under those anxiety test conditions that we were talking about, the implicit ones just outperform explicit every day of the week. So on the subject of performing, under pressure and mental skills, just a quick little, without getting too far into the really heavy sports psych side of things, what are some things you can do to help your athletes, be able to perform to the best of their ability, and some tools to give them in their toolbox to cope with that sort of anxiety. PPRs, that's just a pre-performance routine. Pretty much every athlete has one. Half of them don't realise they do. Okay, so probably the most famous one, anyone that watches the tennis, have you seen what Rafa does before he serves? Like every serve, it's a classic. Yeah, it's this little, pick that out of here, and it's a classic pre-performance routine. Some people's pre-performance routine will start the moment they get out of bed on the morning of a competition. I must get up this time, I must eat this for breakfast, I must put the left sock on before the right sock. Like, it can get kind of crazy. Others, it's just before the actual competition, but they're highly individualised. And as a pre-performance routine, it has a couple of roles. One is to try to get the athlete into that focus and into that zone to perform, and the other one is to try to control the part of their brain that's wanting to get into that negative self-talk, the little voice in the head that says, oh, you're going to stuff this up, or you're going to fall off, or you're going to forget your test, or all those other negative little things that go on before we try and compete. The big thing with pre-performance routines is try to watch and observe your athletes, see what they do. You can work with a sports psych to develop it. Most of the time you'll find athletes figure out what works for them. My only advice is you need to make sure it's portable. So you don't want to have specific resources or specific people that become part of your pre-performance routine. Because when you finally do get selected into a team and that resource isn't there, or that person's not there, or you can't follow that exact routine, you're going to struggle with the lack of that PPR, okay? This one's a classic. This left-hand contractions just fascinates me. And most of the research, I apologise, has been done with right-handed people because the neuroscience around left-handed people is still not quite clear that it works exactly the same. But we know that the right hemisphere of the brain controls the movement on the left side of the body, okay? We also have a lot of research that tells us that the right hemisphere of the brain looks after the automatic kind of behaviours. It's the bit that helps us do things in a lovely, fluid, automatic way. The left side of the brain is that ruminating, overthinking bit that brings us unstuck. So what we try to do right before we have to perform a skill under pressure in competition is to activate the right hemisphere of the brain. Really simple way to do it is to squeeze your left fist, or have a ball and squeeze it in your left hand. So really, really simple, and it actually just stops the rumination process. Again, fascinating research across a whole lot of different sports situations and field tests and things. It's quite new research out of Germany, but really, really simple and not going to do any harm at all, even if you don't get a great response. There's the dual task thing again, so the good old singing, humming, any of those things are really helpful. And the acclimatisation one. Find out what the triggers are for your athlete and try to train them. Whoops, my apologies. Try to train those. Okay, so we've now looked at how do we create an environment that's really going to help them in competition. We've looked at how do we give them skills that are going to stick like glue and not deteriorate under pressure. Now we get to feedback, and I said to you before that those expert coaches, they do this bit a little bit differently. You might be surprised to know, because as coaches we like to talk a lot, says me who's up here talking like crazy. The least preferred learning style of all of the athletes that have been surveyed is verbal. So that's food for thought, isn't it, a little bit? We need to look at exploring other methods of feedback. The research tells us that the most powerful form of feedback is when the task or the activity itself is actually providing the feedback to the athlete. Okay, now that can be a little bit hard to create in our context in equestrian. You really got to think about how that might work. If I try to give you an example from another sport, and you might be able to go laterally with that a little bit. If you're shooting a basket in basketball, and you miss the basket, it's pretty clear feedback, isn't it? You didn't achieve the task. I suppose one example for us, and I apologise for the jumping reference to the dressage people in the room, but if you're trying to write a related line and it's a 5-stride line and you've written it in 6, you don't need the coach necessarily to tell you that you didn't make the distance, okay? So the task is giving you the feedback. What we know is that strong, direct, immediate feedback that's provided by the actual activity is really powerful for learning. So if you can twist your brains around how you might be able to leverage that, you're going to get some really good results. Video analysis, we all know, is really, really powerful as well, and the expert coaches use that a lot more than what they use verbal feedback, and they also really try to engage their athletes in self-reflection to get them to start to lead that feedback process. This next bit is probably revision for most of you. It's probably nothing new. We all know about the positive-negative ratio in feedback. The latest research kind of sits at around 4:1 in terms of positive to negative, being the best in terms of developing long-term self-determined forms of motivation. But that's a whole topic for another day if we get into the SDT research. Try to make sure the feedback's really specific, and again, this is not new, but it's worth reiterating because we still hear a lot of, yep, that's good, great, yeah, good, well done. How's that useful? Okay, that's not feedback. That might be encouragement, but it's not feedback. Feedback needs to be really targeted, really specific. What's good about it? Why is it good? Okay, so we need to be specific and we need to give them the information with which to correct it or to fix it. The expert coaches will be really targeted and really concise with their feedback, and most of them have these short little coaching cues. They're normally 2 to 3 words. And what you want to do is try to develop cues yourself with your athletes that you use consistently. So you'll have a little cue phrase and they know what it means, and it's normally evokes a vision or a feeling, and that's something that you can use instead of lengthy sentences. We also talk about trying to use external focus rather than internal focus. I'm sorry, this gets a bit heavy back into the psych area again. This is very similar to what I said about the explicit versus implicit learning. So if you create an internal focus, so if your feedback is actually relating to telling your rider about how you want them to move a certain part of their body, so if it's about them and it's internal, that can create that self-conscious kind of performance, or what we call, conscious thinking as opposed to the automatic thinking. So ideally, we want feedback that has an external focus, not an internal focus. Sounds pretty hard to get your head around, doesn't it? One example might be that, if you're wanting them to actually move their shoulders back, for example, and you're saying, in a jumping seat, for example, that you want them to bring their shoulders back, maybe think about the end result. So how do you want that angle to look? Do you want that angle in the upper body to be more open? So the external focus is what effect do you want the movement of their body to have, rather than how do you want them to move their body. Does that make sense? Can you kind of differentiate the two? So if you really get into how you want them to explicitly move their body, we're getting back into that sort of conscious processing, which we know can lead to choking. The last little point here about this part of the feedback is be careful what you praise and how you praise. And again, this is a whole nother topic about growth mindsets, but you want to try to praise effort and persistence over outcomes, okay? Because whatever you praise, you'll get more of. That behaviour, your athlete will give you more of. They respond to that praise. What you want is for them to continue to strive and to put in maximum effort and to persist and to persevere. Then the improvement will come. So we try not to focus just on the outcome. And praise also needs to be genuine. Athletes will know if it's insincere, and that can be quite demotivating. Okay, this is a biggie. When it comes to feedback, more is not better. Okay? Over-coaching creates cognitive overload in your athletes, they can't process, they tune out because you never shut up, and the coach becomes a crutch, without which the athlete can't perform. So if your aim is to create autonomous athletes that can perform to the best of their ability in a performance competition environment, you can't become the crutch. So really beware about overcoaching. Just a reminder that high frequency feedback, lots of feedback, will lead to more immediate improvement. But low frequency feedback is going to lead to more long-term learning and better eventual performance. So you won't see the gain in the short term, but you will see it in the longer term. It's a tough sell, isn't it? When, mum and dad are paying for the lessons and, Joe Bloggs next door is getting a lot more of a result in a shorter space of time. I'm not underestimating how difficult this is in this context, but we can't escape the evidence. Try to fade the feedback as soon as you can. So as soon as your athlete is improving and they are developing, start to fade, start to sort of step out of it a little bit and let them become more autonomous. I think the questioning bit for me is really important. This is really underutilised. We don't ask enough questions and we don't ask good enough questions. And questioning is something that to be good at it, you really need to plan it. Expert coaches, when they plan a session, they plan the questions that they're going to ask at each stage of that learning. And they don't plan just one question. They will scaffold them, much the way that a teacher would. And they think about the series of questions, if I ask this and I don't quite get what I'm looking for, what am I going to ask next? What's the probe going to be? What's the alternative going to be? So good questioning is really, really important. And you need to use those open, divergent questions, the what, the how. Be careful with the why. We do need to know the why. We want our athletes to think about the why, but sometimes when we pose the why, it can sound a bit confronting. It can sort of put the athlete on the spot and they get a bit like, if you say, well, why did you make that decision? Oh, I don't know. It can be a little challenging. So it's a little softer sometimes if you say, what was the reason that you took that option? As opposed to saying why. You're going to get same information, you're just not going to get them as rattled. Resist the urge to jump in with the answer. That's harder to do than you think. When there's that awkward, uncomfortable silence and there's blank faces staring at you and mum and dad sitting on the sideline thinking, we're paying this person because they're supposed to have the answers. It's tough not to jump in, but you need to sit in that space and you need to work out how you're going to try to lead your athlete to the answers. And try to encourage that strategic thinking. Whether it's, in person or in video review, there's a huge amount of benefit in that kind of questioning. If you're coaching in a clinic situation, and I know most of the dressage coaches don't, teach group lessons, but the jumping coaches do it quite a lot. And for safety reasons, you often have a group that's standing stationary. You can really leverage your questioning when you couple it with observational learning. There's some fascinating research about observational learning. Don't underestimate how much people can learn from watching others, especially when you combine it with some really good questioning. And when you pose those questions, don't pose it to one rider, pose the question to the group so they all have to go into that struggling problem-solving space and try to nut it out before you select one of them to give you an answer. That way you're getting the whole group to have some learning benefit out of that. The questioning is really, really important. So let's have a look at the practical implications. I've waffled on for quite a while about all of the theory and what it looks like from a scientific research point of view, but what might it mean for you? What are some of the takeaways for you in your space? Think about how you might try to invest some more time in designing your practice environments and the kind of activities you're going to use, and let those lead the learning. That's not always easy to do. I know, for a lot of jumping coaches and coaches in general, you're teaching one lesson back to back after another. Whatever activity you had set up for the previous one is kind of what you end up doing a modified version of with the next one, because you don't have time to move everything. So it can be really challenging in that real world environment. And it does require a bit of a mindset shift. And I think it doesn't just require a mindset shift at an individual level. I think collectively, it's a cultural shift in terms of the expectations that some of that lesson time will be devoted to setting up what might be the ideal environment for that athlete at that time, and for the planning component that is a part of that. Replicate the competition wherever you can, at a developmentally appropriate level for your athletes. Think about what are the key challenges for them when they go out to compete, and really try to replicate that, and try to bring in the pressure and the anxiety and the things that are really going to challenge them. Keep them in that struggle zone as much as you can, but you need to explain why. You can't suddenly go from everything being warm and fuzzy and nice and they're in their comfort zone every week to all of a sudden they're really uncomfortable, because they just won't come back. Unless there's some education and some understanding about why we're doing this and what the long-term benefits are, it's not going to be great for business. Avoid overcoaching. Okay, really try not to just fall into the trap of thinking that you need to say a lot in order to be effective, or to be seen to be giving people, value for money, or following the cultural norms to some extent within the sport. Be really prudent with your words and make them count. Less telling, more asking. You're robbing your athletes of a learning opportunity every time you just tell them how to do something. If there's a possibility that you could pose it as a question or a series of questions and let them solve the problem and come up with a solution on their own, that's far more powerful for their learning in the longer term, and it will stick. If you just jump to the telling, which is a whole lot easier and a whole lot faster, you're doing them a disservice. Try to ask better questions, and that takes practice. Build as much decision making as you can into your practice sessions. Really think about what are the key decision making things that your athletes need to have, and then try to create an environment that is going to make those decisions happen. Encourage problem solving. Try not to jump in with the solution, as we said. And embrace mistakes. Embrace that idea of failing forward. Okay, we don't want to create a fear of failure. We want them to think that mistakes are a really important part of learning, and they are critical if we're going to reach expertise. It doesn't matter in what field we're talking about. And try to facilitate the development of a growth mindset in your athletes, that persistence, that effort. We know that achieving expertise in any field takes a really long time, around that 10,000 hours, 10-year kind of rule. They have to stick with the sport for a long time to get good at it. And there's going to be a lot of ups and downs, a lot of setbacks, a lot of disappointments along the way. So the way that you can equip them to sort of ride that out is by generating self-determined motivation. And that comes from that sort of growth mindset, that sense of being rewarded for effort and persistence. And at the end of the day, the improvement's going to follow. So if I had, one final little piece of advice from, working with a lot of coaches at a fairly elite level in a whole lot of different sports, it's probably 2 words if you can't take anything else out of today's session. Stay really curious. Keep your mind really open, and don't just look within your sport. Don't just look within sport. The biggest skill set that determines where coaches go with their career, what we're learning from the research, is their intrapersonal skills. So of course we need to have that technical knowledge, that sport-specific knowledge, and we need to have really good interpersonal skills. We need to be good communicators, we need to form relationships. But the real differentiator is the intrapersonal skills. Things like self-awareness, self-reflection, being open to learning. If you don't have those things, you just get left behind and you'll never really reach your full potential. So try to stay open and stay curious and keep exploring and keep looking for how you might make connections and find a little bit of learning in all of those other kind of weird places. Thank you for listening and staying awake.